Imagine stepping onto an airplane in 1937 and vanishing into thin air. No wreckage, no signals, just silence. The newspapers kept printing the same empty headline. The radios kept hissing with nothing but sea breath and static. And somewhere over a blue horizon, the map folded in on itself. A line of flight became a question mark. Crowds tilted their heads toward the Pacific and listened, as if the ocean could be persuaded to answer. If you boarded a flight today and it disappeared without a trace, the entire world would stop. Yet, less than a century ago, that is exactly what happened to Amelia Earhart. Your phone would light up, satellites would triangulate, search grids would bloom across the water like chessboards of urgency. But in the late 1930s, certainty was fragile. A woman who had already crossed an ocean, who wore courage the way others wore a scarf against the wind, lifted off, and the world learned how loud a silence can be. Airports fell quiet. Mechanics stared at fuel gauges that were not theirs. A nation that had cheered her takeoffs now counted heartbeats between unanswered calls. Tonight, you'll walk through the skies she crossed, the fears she carried, and the mystery that still lingers in the waves of the Pacific. We'll trace the soft pencil of her route across weathered charts, hear the clipped voices of radio operators straining through static, and feel the hum of a twin-engine Lockheed as it drinks the miles. We'll meet the woman beneath the legend, the laughter behind the press photographs, the private doubts that visit even the bravest at dawn. And we'll follow the searchers who refuse to give up, reading the ocean the way a librarian reads history, line by shimmering line. To understand her fate, we must first enter her world, an age of leather jackets, roaring engines, and boundless ambition. Step onto the tarmac, where heat shimmers above the runway and gasoline sweetens the air. Night falls in bronze and violet over island harbors. Hangar doors rumble open. A navigator folds a sextant back into its case. Propellers turn. Rivets glitter like small stars. In that glow, before radar could cradle a plane, before navigation was anything but nerve and numbers, Amelia Earhart climbs into the cockpit, leans into the wind, and aims her compass at the edge of the known. The story begins there, where courage meets horizon. The first thing you notice is the sound. It comes low and steady at first, a distant purr that tickles the ribs, then swells into a brazen chorus, the churn of twin propellers biting the air. Radios answer with their own music, clipped voices, code-like syllables, then the soft snowfall of static. In a crowded hangar, someone tests a microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, and the vowels bloom with metallic warmth. Outside, a crowd answers in waves, applause breaking like surf, whistles rising and fading, that simple human sound of breath caught between pride and worry. It's the 1930s, and engines are the new brass section of the century. The air has a smell you can almost taste. Gasoline hangs sweet and stingy at the edge of the tongue. Engine oil brings a dark, metallic comfort, like the scent of rain on a rail line. Fresh newspapers arrive still warm from the press, ink smudging the fingers. Headlines shouting in bold, flight, record, world. On the tarmac, heat lifts from the asphalt in shimmering veils, curling around ankles and boots. Inside the hangar, a cooler breath moves. Sawdust, canvas, wax. The patient odor of wood crates labeled with cities that sound like promises. Touch is everywhere. The pilot's jacket weighs on the shoulders with a steady, reassuring pull. Its leather grain a map of past winds. Gloves creak as hands flex around the yoke. The instrument panel meets the fingertips with little clicks and gentle stops. Mixture, throttle, trim. The seat beneath is firm and familiar, upholstered in leather that holds the day's warmth. At altitude, the air sharpens. It creeps down the sleeves and up the collar until cheeks tingle and ears feel the thinness of the world. Even on the ground, you can feel the plane before it moves. Subtle shivers through the frame, a hum in the bones, the way a bird tightens before taking the sky. Light draws its own geography. In Manhattan, neon scripts the night in electric cursive. Yellow, pink, blue, pooling color on rain-dark streets. On distant islands, dawn arrives in a hush of pearl and gold, and the ocean flashes coins of light where the sun finds a ripple. In midday, the Pacific turns to hammered silver, blinding and beautiful. Toward evening, the water darkens to navy ink that swallows the day's last glints. In hangars across the world, single bulbs dangle from long cords, turning rivets into constellations and propeller edges into moons. Aviator goggles catch it all, their lenses holding a small private sunset. Now, let the present loosen its grip. Airports today are glass cathedrals of efficiency, soft beeps and rolling suitcases. But listen past that. Hear the chunk of a hangar door sliding along its track, the barked laugh of a mechanic under a wing, the slow syllables of a meteorologist reading a forecast off a wall-sized map. See paper charts spread wide, edges anchored by coffee cups. See a navigator's sextant gleaming like a pocketed star. In a corner, a woman ties back her hair with a scarf the color of courage. She doesn't ask permission to belong in this room. The room adjusts to her gravity. We are watching a world that calls speed a virtue and distance a dare. The radio is not yet a safety net. It is a wire strung over an abyss. Radar is a rumor, a glimmer at the edges of possibilities. Navigation is arithmetic and nerve, sun angles and dead reckoning, an art that smells of pencil shavings and salt. Reporters wait with notebooks cocked, ink ready. Admirers wait with flowers that wilt fast in the heat. Children crane for a glimpse of the plane's nose number, the way they might stare at the face of a comet. Crowds part with that special hush reserved for beginnings. A voice reads a few ceremonial words: courage, record, history, and even the impatient engines seem to listen. Earhart steps forward without theatricality, as if answering a call from just beyond the horizon. The jacket sits right on her shoulders. The cap fits. The expression is not bravado. Its focus trimmed to a fine edge. She exchanges brief words with her navigator, quiet sentences that hold the shape of miles. The airplane is a companion, temperamental, powerful, eager. Together they smell of fuel and future. The cockpit is a small embassy of order. Dials with steady red needles, glass that reflects a miniature world, levers that remember each hand. The radio crackles. Voices, coordinates, a weather station that sounds like wind learning language. She checks the list not as ritual, but as conversation. Oil pressure, fuel, magnetos. The propellers turn with a confident blur, and the floor trembles in the way that says, the Earth will soon be optional. Beyond the runway's end, the ocean waits with its long, patient breath. In daylight, it is a quilt of colors: jade near shallows, cobalt over depths, streaked with white seams where currents argue. In darkness, it becomes a polished stone. Ships leave wakes that write and vanish at once. Islands sit like green syllables scattered over a sentence too wide to read in one glance. Somewhere, A tiny speck named Howland marks a promise on a chart. The 1930s hum around all of this. Streetcars buzz. Jazz curls out of open windows. Movie palaces pour out gloved couples into the cool night. In parlors, families lean toward radios, the way plants lean toward light, catching news of flights that knit continents closer. The future is an exhale away, and still a guess. A woman in a leather jacket becomes an argument you can't dismiss. That sky belongs to everyone who dares to measure it with their own footsteps in the clouds. And so the bridge completes itself. We step from our world of satellite certainty into an age that wove courage into cloth and stitched roots with pencil on paper. The tempo softens. The crowd's applause thins to a murmur. The airplane seems to listen with you, engine idling like a heartbeat at rest. Neon dims to a few scattered embers. The ocean's light folds to a sheen. In that gentler hush, Amelia Earhart climbs into her place at the controls, settles the headset over her ears, and feels the clean weight of possibility. The runway stretches ahead, narrow as a vow. The sky, unpromised and immense, waits with its quiet question. She was born far from the ocean she would one day challenge, born amid the dry light of Kansas, where summer fields roll out like quilts and winter gnaws fences down to the wire. In family albums, she appears as a slim figure with alert eyes, a girl who carried pockets full of string and found treasures, who kept notes on scraps and pressed leaves between pages. The house was not always steady. Money came and wavered. Adults spoke in lowered voices when they thought worry could be kept behind a door. But Amelia understood early that the world extends well beyond a front porch. She climbed trees, built improvised sleds, and skinned knees with the happy economy of childhood. Curiosity felt like a birthright. Her mother did not shorten that curiosity. She let Amelia and her sister wear bloomers for climbing and kept her tone even when dresses snagged and hems blackened with dust. Amelia kept lists in a journal. Things to learn, things to build, things to do before the summer was gone. When she discovered a scrapbook of newspaper clippings about women who did unusual things, lawyers, mechanics, mountain climbers, she felt something in her align, like a compass needle giving up its confusion. It wasn't fame she envied, but the permission those women had carved out of the world to study, to attempt, to exist beyond the polite frame. By adolescence, the wind itself had become a signal. She liked the mechanics of things, gears and levers, and the secret grammar inside machines. She spent afternoons taking apart small contraptions and evening hours in public libraries, learning the way facts can stack quietly and still build a bridge. During a family trip to the Iowa State Fair, she saw an exhibition flight, a biplane dragging the sky behind it as if it were a ribbon. The plane's shadow passed over her shoes, and though she pretended nonchalance, something electric stepped through her. The feeling would wait, patient and persistent, like a letter left unmailed. When the First World War interrupted the optimism of the century, she volunteered as a nurse's aide in Toronto. There she learned the weight of suffering and the discipline of care, the way a hand can steady when another cannot. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and stubborn hope. Soldiers with bandaged heads and missing limbs told stories that trailed off at doorways. Amelia learned how to listen without leaning too hard on words. Death was a frequent visitor, grief a shared language. She did not become hardened. She became aware of how thin the margin is between ordinary days and those that tilt forever. After the war, the old letter to the sky found a stamp. In 1920, in California, she paid a pilot for a short flight, a 10-minute hop over fields parched to a soft brown. The plane shuddered and lifted, and the world rearranged itself. Rivers made sudden sense. Roads drew lines as if for the first time. Houses turned to tiles. People became moving commas in a larger sentence. She landed laughing, giddy in the marrow. "As soon as we left the ground," she would later say, "I knew I had to fly." The certainty did not ask, it announced. Lessons began. The field was dusty, the planes temperamental, the instructors pragmatic and a little amused. She sold a treasured car to fund hours in the air. Flying felt like work and music at once, a precise conversation between throttle and lift, a new kind of arithmetic with answers you could feel through your bones. She learned to coax an engine into smoothness and to respect the way air can insist. Wind gusts have personalities. Clouds carry etiquette. She liked the way the checklist calmed the mind. Magnetos, mixture, fuel. She loved the moment the ground let go. Her first plane was a second-hand Kinner Airster, a small yellow creature she nicknamed the Canary, a name as much for its color as for the voice it gave her. With it, she climbed into the thin blue until the engine's complaint became a triumph. In 1922, she set an altitude mark for women pilots, over 14,000 feet. Learning how the body negotiates with cold and thin air, how the mind must stay plain and methodical when the world narrows to instrument needles and a horizon like a blade. At the field, she greeted other pilots with a mechanic's handshake. She could take off a cowling and examine a spark plug with practical tenderness, could tell by a shiver if something was off by the smallest degree. Being a woman in this realm was both novelty and argument. Reporters liked the angle. "Lady Lindy," they wrote, trying to arrange her into a comparison that would sit well with the public. She disliked the nickname, but understood publicity's machinery. It could fund flights, buy fuel, ease negotiations for hangar space. Her eyes, bright under a cap brim, kept checking the horizon anyway. Flights for the sake of photographs made her restless. Flights that asked skill and nerve steadied her. In 1928 came the leap that made her a headline, the Atlantic crossing with Wilmer Stultz and Lou Gordon. She was billed as the first woman to fly across the ocean, though she would admit she was more passenger than pilot that time. Still, the experience braided everything: fear, awe, patience, the godlike indifference of weather. The plane rode the Atlantic's moods, while the crew measured time in fuel and position reports. When land finally rose, no larger than the palm of a hand, and then suddenly enormous, something in her resolved. Back home, the press flashed its bulbs, bouquets appeared, and voices lined up to call her brave. In private, she felt an edge. I haven't done it yet, not under my own hand. She absorbed the noise of fame with a kind of courteous distance. She could charm a radio audience without letting them own her, answer a journalist's impertinent question with a smile that implied the next one should be better. She also used the microphone to open doors for others, encouraging women to study, to work, to pilot their own ambitions into weather of their choosing. When she wrote clearly. When she spoke, she kept metaphors simple and true. Courage, she insisted, was not the absence of fear, but the decision that something else mattered more. In 1931, she married George Putnam, a publisher who understood both story and strategy. Their courtship had been marked by practical letters as much as affection, negotiations between a woman who would not be limited and a man who promised not to try. On the morning of their wedding, she wrote him a note that was less vow than treaty, asking for a marriage of equals and stating that she would not be bound by traditional obligations that might clip the wings of her work. "I shall not hold you to any medieval code of faithfulness to me," she wrote, "nor shall I consider myself so bound to you." It was not cynicism, it was clarity. They were partners, and partnership, like flight, had to be piloted. Then there was the solo Atlantic in 1932, a feat that braided her name into the century's spine. Alone over water, in weather that sneered at forecasts, she wrestled ice and fatigue, nursed the engine with the calm a pilot must keep when the body would prefer panic. She landed not in Paris, as she had intended, but in a pasture in Ireland, where a farmer asked if she had flown far. "From America," she answered, with the understatement of someone who respects the sky too much to brag. Medals followed, invitations, the warm, measurable weight of honor. But even those hung lightly. What mattered was the proof that she had done exactly what she said she would do and survived the conversation with the Atlantic intact. What kind of person bears both acclaim and responsibility without turning brittle? With Amelia, the public saw a hero's silhouette, the jacket, the grin, the fine tilt of the head. In private, friends described someone who listened well and joked dryly, who could be shy at a crowded table and bold at a runway's edge. She worried about money and made meticulous budgets. She collected friends the way a careful gardener collects seeds, knowing which might flourish in sunlight and which under shade. She answered letters from young girls with care, never lying about difficulty, but never allowing difficulty to pretend it forbids. She was brave in the sense that brave people often are, by habit, by training, and with the full awareness that fear visits even the well-prepared. Vulnerability shadowed that bravery without diminishing it. She was not a machine. In the cockpit, there were moments when the horizon wavered, when fatigue shook the hands, when instrument needles seemed to move with mysterious intention. The trick wasn't to banish these moments, but to let them pass through without inheriting the controls. On the ground, there were days when the machinery of celebrity ground at her patience, endorsements to negotiate, speeches to tailor, manufacturers to appease, editors who wanted copy by Tuesday and would take a slice of her voice if she let them. She felt the gap between the person she was and the emblem the world wanted, and she worked, gently, steadily, to keep them close enough to recognize each other. That was the moral scramble of her adult years, to be a symbol without becoming only one. She wanted to make a living in the air, which meant courting publicity. She wanted girls to imagine pilots with their faces, which meant allowing her own face to be printed and sold. She wanted to push aviation forward, which meant taking risks that the public applauded and later questioned. She wanted, simply, to fly. Her diary entries reveal a person aware that inspiration can become burden, that an icon must also eat breakfast, refuel, and find a moment in the day to laugh freely. There were choices that never came with easy labels. When sponsors offered funds in exchange for appearances, was that compromise or strategy? Each event paid for fuel, for maintenance, for the infrastructure that made daring possible without being foolish. When a manufacturer asked her to test a plane for the cameras, to stand on a wing for a photograph, to present a polished confidence that would sell, She asked questions first about safety, then about message. She did not wish to shill. She wanted, instead, to be a useful bridge between an industry hungry for customers and a public still deciding whether airplanes belong to a privileged few or to everyone. Newspapers loved the angle of firsts, but firsts were never the point. Records are ladders. They exist to be climbed and then replaced by taller ones. She spoke more of roots than titles, more of education than of medals. She encouraged women to learn to fly, not for novelty, but for utility, to deliver mail, to ferry planes, to build the steady hidden columns that hold an industry upright. When she helped form an organization for women pilots, she wanted it to be pragmatic as well as proud, a place where a young aviator could find a mentor, a mechanic, a map that included her in its logic. At home, the domestic world and the aerial one learned to share a schedule. Dinner might be postponed for a weather window. Letters were drafted at odd hours and taped with small notes to self, revise altitude data, call about carburetor. George managed the public glow while she managed the private flame. Friends remembered simple pleasures, a walk along a cold beach, cooking something unremarkable but happy, reading a novel by a window where light pooled like warmth. She loved small, ordinary things, a well-shaped chair, the clean order of a toolbox, a map with neat pencil marks that didn't demand applause. Yet the emblem had teeth. With every success, expectations grew a new layer. School children asked for miracles in crayon. Editors asked for bigger arcs, brighter headlines. If she flew a continent, why not a world? If she crossed an ocean, why not two? The pressure could be kind and choking at once. She would look at a route and see the math of fuel, the vagaries of weather, the question marks where tiny islands breathed in the middle of blue. Others would see an arrow, simple and heroic. She learned to answer both, to acknowledge the drama while whispering to those who would listen that drama does not keep you aloft. Discipline does. As plans for a world-circling flight tightened, the dilemmas tightened too. Was this ambition for the sake of aviation, a demonstration of what aircraft and careful planning could accomplish, or a concession to a public always asking for larger spectacles? The answer was not a single word. It was a braid. She wanted to contribute to the book of what's possible, and also to hold the pen while that chapter was written. She wanted to show that method and nerve could be partners, that the map could be traced by anyone ready to do the unglamorous work behind each glamorous line. At the same time, she felt the ache of being watched, weighed, and sometimes underestimated by those who used the words "lady pilot," as if the phrase itself explained limits. On weathered charts, the Pacific spreads like a second sky, dotted with specks the size of fingernails. She knew the arithmetic of those specks. She studied radio telephony, learned frequencies, rehearsed procedures with a mind that preferred preparation to luck. Even so, the ocean is a kind of personality, beautiful, moody, and unwilling to explain itself. In quiet moments, she felt the nearness of risk as one feels the coolness of a stone in a pocket. Not alarming, but honest. She did not loathe fear. She used it. Fear sharpened attention, kept her from arrogance, taught her to pack and repack until each item's presence could be justified by reason, not hope. With all this came the narrower, tender conflicts. To fly meant to leave. To leave meant to ask those who loved her to practice a generous patience. Letters to family were careful, keeping the balance between candor and comfort. "I am well," she would write, even when a storm had peeled layers of confidence from the day. "I am careful," even when a part of her relished the honest sternness of a challenge met late at night with only two instruments and a stubborn will. She did not devalue the fears of those who waited on the ground. She just asked them to trust the person who returned from the sky each time a little quieter, a little more certain of why it mattered. If you stood with her at a hangar door, the hour early, the air gentle with the sweetness of fuel and dew, you might hear her confess what every pilot knows. Flight does not cure you of yourself. It introduces you to yourself more clearly. The cockpit is a mirror that doesn't flatter. It reflects your skill, your bias, your patience, your panic, your habit of mind when circumstances squeeze. She liked that honesty. It fit the way she arranged her life. No melodrama, no showiness that wasn't in service of something practical. Even her famous smile, on closer inspection, was less a beam than a steady light. The newspapers, unfailingly hungry, sometimes pressed her into the role of fearless heroine. She corrected them gently. "I have fears," she would say. "I am anxious sometimes." The point was not to be fearless, but to keep company with fear, without ceding the pilot's seat to it. That distinction mattered to her in the same way the difference between altitude and attitude matters to a plane. Subtle but decisive, the kind that rearranges outcomes. So the myth gathered around her like morning fog on a runway, soft, luminous, distorting, and revealed by the slightest shift in light. She stepped through it to the plane where the checklist waited, where facts had no interest in applause. She kept the jacket, yes, and the scarf when the day asked for wind. But beneath the leather lay a person built of practicalities. Maps, pencil marks, weather reports, the mathematics of range, the patient habit of discipline. If the world needed a symbol, she would give it a symbol that honored the work. A symbol not of magic, but of mastery, earned one careful hour at a time. And if there was a price for that symbol, she paid it, gladly, when it bought opportunity for others, cautiously, when it threatened to steal her privacy or distort her voice. The dilemmas never simplified into slogans. They were navigated the way a pilot flies an uncertain coast, eyes open, hands steady, reading the small signals, wind shift, needle twitch, a new texture in the engine's hum, and adjusting, adjusting, adjusting. That was her nature. A courage that respected limits, a vulnerability that told the truth, a will that did not confuse recklessness with daring. In the end, the girl from Kansas did not outgrow the child who filled her pockets with string. She simply learned to tie different knots. She knotted weather to planning, public expectation to personal intention, legend to the daily labor that makes a legend breathe. When she stepped toward her plane, she carried all of this with her. The applause that could finance a flight, the doubts that kept her careful, the hopes of strangers folded into envelopes, the knowledge that the sky is both invitation and test. And as the propellers blurred, as noise rose into a field of sound that shakes ribs and clears thought, she did what she had always done, placed her hands on the controls, felt the weight of the day yield, and aimed not at immortality, but at a line on a chart that promised the next honest mile. The 1930s held two clocks in the same room. One ticked with the old rhythm of custom. Parlors arranged for company. Newspapers folded to the classifieds, where work was sorted by gender, the word ladylike used as offense. The other clicked forward in steel and radio waves. Cars sweeping dust off roads. Skyscrapers learning to touch weather. Voices carried across states in the time it took to lift an eyebrow. Women had already voted for a decade, yet the vote hadn't immediately unlocked the rooms where paychecks were signed or decisions were made. Most help-wanted ads still split the world into two columns. At banks, a woman might be a teller, not a manager. In laboratories, a woman might assist, not lead. In the air, the story was still being drafted. The old clock insisted the sky was no place for a woman. The new one asked who would prove it wrong. At the kitchen tables of the Depression, thrift became a craft, and many women kept households from collapsing by turning cents into supper and scraps into dresses that lasted another season. Respectable work was framed narrowly. Teaching, nursing, secretarial posts, roles that sounded like extensions of home. Yet the decade was also noisy with departures. Women lined up for civil service exams, enrolled in night classes, learned to type faster than assumptions. Movie palaces introduced heroines with their own sharp edges, and jazz clubs offered evenings where a woman could wear a dress the color of a dare. Even so, each step forward carried an echo of the old rule. Be extraordinary, but don't look as if you're trying. That double standard rubbed like an ill-fitted glove. Into this tension walked aviation, a field that felt less like a profession and more like an announcement that the future had arrived early. Airplanes were not merely vehicles. They were metaphors with propellers, swift, modern, indifferent to old maps. The interwar world needed them. Nations recovering from the First World War were building new networks of trade and news and diplomacy. The sky shortened the distance between capitals. Airmail stitched continents with unseen thread. Passengers learned that time, too, could be compressed. In magazines, artists drew sleek silhouettes against sunsets. Engineers returned to their drafting tables to make the art real. To step into a cockpit in that era was to step into technology's front line. There were few safety nets. Radio was improving, but capricious. Navigation was an elegant gamble of math and patience, and engines still had moods. Pilots learned the habits of their machines the way a sailor learns a ship's creaks. Airports were fewer and farther. Weather forecasting was more educated guess than oracle. Risk was never abstract. Yet the work promised a rearrangement of limits that felt both practical and intoxicating. Mail delivered in hours instead of days. Medical supplies flown over impassable roads. Families connected by air routes that traced hope into the atlas. A woman in that cockpit changed more than altitude. She disturbed the arrangement of expectations on the ground. Boys could dream of the sky without asking permission. Girls, too often, were told to dream responsibly. So when a woman buckled in, warmed the engine, and taxied toward a horizon that had never asked for a chaperone, the image became a classroom. It said, "Ability is not a courtesy title. It is a set of skills that can be learned, practiced, and proven." In an era fascinated by firsts, the first woman to cross an ocean alone wasn't just an entry in a ledger. It was a lever that shifted how ordinary conversations went. The next time a daughter said she wanted to study engineering, a parent might picture leather gloves closing over a yoke and pause at the edge of no. But images need amplifiers, and the 1930s had a new one: mass media. Newspapers were quick with ink, radio quicker with breath. Editors understood that readers liked headlines that felt like drum rolls. Broadcasters loved a voice that could make courage sound like good manners. Amelia Earhart stepped into that system with a wary intelligence. She did not dislike attention. She disliked attention that was careless. In interviews, she shaved cliches off questions with a calm smile. When a journalist called her Lady Lindy, she accepted the public's need for comparison without allowing the nickname to define the work. She spoke clearly about preparation, equipment, weather, things that turned legend back into labor. She wanted the story told in a way that would help the next pilot, not just flatter the audience. Politics noticed. In Washington, officials recognized that aviation was not merely an industry, but a stage on which national competence could be performed. Countries competed in the air as much as on trade floors. Records and routes translated into prestige. A polished photograph of a pilot stepping from a plane could suggest that a nation's engines were tuned, its factories busy, its future unsentimental. The United States, still recovering from economic grief, liked the sight of someone American accomplishing something the world could not ignore. When that someone was a woman, the picture carried an extra charge, a subtle argument that democracy was nimble enough to expand its circles. Earhart navigated these currents with the same blend of instinct and calculation she used in a crosswind. She attended White House receptions, shook hands with men who signed bills, and made the case, quietly, persistently, that aviation required infrastructure, funding, research, and training. She did not pretend that inspiration alone could keep a plane aloft. Runways had to be graded, weather services funded, radios standardized, beacons installed, mechanics trained. Her advocacy, tucked into speeches and editorials, helped move aviation from spectacle to system. If the public saw daring, she hoped policymakers would see the blueprint behind it. All the while, the expectations attached to her gender kept asking for a performance she would not give. Newspapers wanted glamour. She gave them neat, practical style. Scandal. She offered none. Docility. She declined. She modeled clothing that made sense in a cockpit, sensible cuts, sturdy fabric, knowing that a woman cannot crash-proof a machine but can crash-proof her pockets. She endorsed products carefully, choosing those that paid for fuel without cheapening the craft. In a decade where many women's ambitions had to be smuggled into acceptable shapes, she practiced a visible ambition that carried its own modesty. Not, look at me, but look what is possible. The women who watched her were not all future pilots. Some were teachers who needed a parable to tell a restless class. Some were factory workers who liked seeing a woman's face set seriously in the machinery of a modern world. Some were girls who kept a secret list under a mattress, things to study, places to go, a passport to stamp. Role models don't distribute identical futures. They broaden the definition of future itself. Earhart's mailbag filled with letters that began, "I never thought, until I saw." The sentence always ended differently, but its beginning was the same hinge. Resistance existed, of course. There were editorials that praised her bravery before returning to warm sermons about a woman's place. There were men who admired her courage, but added, with a patience that sounded like condescension, that such feats were exceptions, perhaps even distractions. There were women wary of being told they needed to be heroic to be respected. Earhart's answer to all of them was a steady insistence on ordinary competence. She did not demand that every woman fly. She argued that every woman should be free to choose a craft and be paid properly for mastering it. When she helped launch an organization for women pilots, she wanted its purpose to be practical: instruction, mentorship, standards, a network that exchanged not just applause, but spare parts, routes, job leads, and weather notes. Her relationship with the press was a choreography. She would pose by a plane, because a picture can sponsor 1,000 gallons of fuel, and then ask that the caption include the model, the range, the conditions of the flight. She would tolerate the insistence on lipstick in a photograph, then slip away to check a fuel line. To one side of the camera lens, femininity was a costume she wore lightly. On the other side, it was irrelevant to whether a crosswind demanded a crabbed approach. She managed the contradiction by refusing to let either side cancel the other. A woman could be precise and gracious, public and private, iconic and busy. Politicians, for their part, saw in her a useful ambassador. She could visit an airfield opening and turn a ribbon cutting into a civics lesson about the future's infrastructure. She could sit before a committee and speak about the need for standardized radio frequencies without sounding like a scold. She could write an article that made the case for aviation education in high schools without losing a reader to jargon. In a decade, suspicious of elites, yet hungry for expertise, she modeled a version of authority that felt neighborly. Authority, her example suggested, is not a tone of voice, but the habit of showing your work. The interwar world itself was learning how fragile the modern looked up close. Europe simmered. Empires argued their futures. In the Pacific, islands that would one day become battle names were, in the 1930s, dots on a pilot's chart and rest stops for Pan American's flying boats. To fly there was to participate unwittingly in geopolitics. Air routes suggested allegiances. Fuel caches became potential assets. Navigation stations hinted at strategic interest. Earhart's planned world flight threaded through these realities with more innocence than the next decade would allow. It was a civilian itinerary with military implications the future would make obvious. In that sense, the airplane was both messenger and message. The planet was smaller than old maps pretended, and events would soon take advantage of that fact. Back home, in classrooms and clubs, the story of a woman pilot made some arguments easier. When a dean questioned whether women could withstand the rigors of a science course, a student could think of frost forming on a wing, and the woman who coaxed her plane through it alone over the Atlantic. When a hiring manager muttered about reliability, a candidate could mention a coast-to-coast schedule kept to the minute. The logic wasn't perfect. Sexism rarely yields to perfect logic, but public imagination is a battlefield, and Earhart gave the right side better armor. Her example taught a crucial distinction. Individual brilliance is admirable. Institutional access is necessary. She kept nudging the conversation from, "Look what she did," to "Look what many can do if allowed." The Depression's grief did not dull the appetite for wonder. It sharpened it. Newspapers sold hope alongside hard news. Radio programs offered warmth in winter kitchens. Earhart, reading an audience the way she read a barometer, spoke softly, without swagger, as if respectful of the budgets that bought her books or tickets to her lectures. She priced appearances fairly. She refused to gin up danger in her prose to make a sale, insisting that real adventures were already dramatic enough. This ethical tone mattered. It built trust. When she asked readers to consider a new aviation school or to support a bill that would fund better weather stations, they listened. Not every consequence of publicness was kind. Fame carries lint. Rumors stick. Criticisms breed in shadows. Strangers develop the illusion of intimacy. Earhart protected her privacy as one protects a delicate instrument from grit. She and George Putnam managed the flow of information carefully. Releases crafted to inform, not titillate. Boundaries drawn. For friends, for reporters, for herself. When gossip tried to fatten itself on her marriage or motives, she starved it by refusing to perform outrage. The strategy was not passivity, it was triage. Oxygen belongs to the engine, not to the fire that doesn't deserve to burn. As for feminism, the word itself was debated, defended, derided, and constantly redefined. Earhart wore it in a plain, durable cut. She spoke of equal pay, of training, of the right to attempt. She celebrated domestic skill when it was chosen, not assigned, and professional ambition when it was nourished, not mocked. She did not dismiss women who did not wish to fly. She rejected the premise that any woman's place could be assigned by someone else. In speeches, she leaned into the practical. Decide what you want to do. Become expert. Keep your word. Expect resistance. Proceed anyway. For girls in farm towns and city blocks alike, that sounded less like a manifesto than a map. In the hangars where grease lived under fingernails, she earned credibility by knowing the work. Mechanics are not impressed by rhetoric. They are convinced by a pilot who can name a part correctly, who hears a misfire early, who respects their craft. Earhart did. She made friends in those shadows. Men who would stay late to adjust a governor because they trusted the person asking. Women who learned repair from her and passed it on. Apprentices who discovered that dignity lives as comfortably in overalls as in tuxedos. If equality needed proof, the shop floor provided it daily. Skill does not check gender before choosing a pair of hands. In press photos, the crowd's faces tell their own story. Fathers lift children onto shoulders. Women in hats tilt forward, eyes narrowed against sun and skepticism both. Boys look at the plane, girls look at the pilot. An elderly man, cane planted like a period at his feet, nods as if some old argument has just lost another inch. The scene repeats itself across cities and fields. Over years, a public gradually training itself to witness something new without flinching. Culture rarely surrenders in epiphanies. It yields to repetition. Earhart provided the repetition. Competence performed in daylight, again and again, until critics had to find fresh complaints or fall quiet. Aviation, meanwhile, complicated and matured. Airlines built timetables that could be counted on. Aircraft grew safer and more comfortable. Radio ranges extended like invisible fences that kept planes oriented in bad weather. Government agencies codified procedures. Checklists multiplied. Small airports learned to talk with bigger ones in the same technical dialect. The heroics of the barnstorming age ceded ground to the professionalism of the air transport era. Earhart appreciated the shift. She liked romance as a garnish, not as an operating principle. The more aviation resembled a public utility, predictable, affordable, safe, the more democratic it became. Her advocacy pointed there, from rare spectacle to common service. In classrooms where globes sat on wooden stands, teachers pinned yarn from city to city to show how routes formed new geographies. Children traced fingers over oceans that no longer felt like walls. Somewhere among them sat a girl who would be an engineer, a meteorologist, a test pilot, a controller with a headset, and a voice-like assurance. She didn't need to model her life on Earhart's. She needed to know that a life like that belonged to the menu of real options. That is the quiet revolution of representation. Choices multiply and then, almost shyly, normalize. The closer the world flight approached, the more these strands, gender politics, media machinery, national pride, technological progress, twined into a single rope. Each leg of the journey carried more than a person and a plane. It carried an argument about what the modern world expected of itself. The map on the wall looked simple, lines curving like a loose bracelet around the planet. But each segment was crowded with logistics, permissions to get permissions, fuel arrangements, island contacts, diplomatic courtesies, insurance papers, and press schedules. A man might have been spared some of the condescension braided into the process. A woman with authority had to endure more forms of, "Are you sure?" than any chart could account for. She answered with the one language bureaucracy respects: readiness. If you listen carefully, you can hear, underneath the drone of engines and the snap of flags at airfields, the softer sound of a decade learning to imagine itself braver. There is the echo of a reporter who, after a flight, writes a balanced piece instead of a patronizing one. The sigh of a mother who reads it and thinks, maybe, yes. The scratch of a principal adding an aviation unit to a curriculum. The click of a banker's pen approving a loan for a woman's training. The cheer at a small-town air show when a pilot lands and steps out, helmet under arm, competent as weather. None of these alone alters a century. Together, they tilt it. So the social context that held Amelia Earhart was not merely a backdrop. It was an active weather system. Crosswinds of tradition, thermals of change, a high-pressure ridge of economic hardship, a low-pressure trough of doubt, and a steady isobar of curiosity that refused to move. She flew within it and helped shape it. When we remember her now, we are not just remembering a person. We are remembering a set of conversations a nation had with itself about who belongs where and why. The answers were never unanimous. They still aren't. But somewhere between the old clock and the new, a woman zipped a jacket, checked a compass, and proved that a life could be piloted toward purpose with both grace and stubborn skill. And in proving it, she left a contrail the next travelers could follow. Thin, bright, and once you've seen it, hard to unsee. History in the late 1930s felt like a room holding its breath. The clocks all ran, the trains all kept their timetables, and yet a hush gathered in the corners, the kind you notice before a storm when the birds go quiet. In Europe, flags multiplied like arguments. Speeches reached for higher registers. Borders that had seemed resolved or at least resigned began to bristle again. Factories learned new rhythms, steel moving from civilian patience to military intent. In Asia, Japan's expansion was already a wound, and the Pacific, so wide on the map it looked like a guarantee, became a corridor threaded with anxieties. People bought radios not only for music, but for weather reports of human weather. Declarations, deals, mobilizations, the nervous shuffling of diplomats. The First World War had promised that it was the war to end such things. The decade replied, not yet. Into this atmosphere flew Amelia Earhart, and into it she proposed a journey that would wrap a line around the planet as if to remind humanity that the world was still one continuous thing. A flight around the equatorials was not an escape from politics. It could not be. It was a demonstration. Open-handed, civilian, stubborn, that connection could be a civic act. Where statesmen argued in polished rooms, pilots traced practical lines across the sky and asked, will the distances between us be measured by fear or by routes? Aviation had already started answering. Airmail had turned oceans from obstacles into schedules. Airline timetables arranged the globe into sequences of dawns. Navigational beacons penciled certainty into the night. To fly around the world was to write, in a language made of headings and fuel, the sentence that steamships had begun and telegraphs had accelerated, that the planet is not a collection of separate concerns, but a single, complicated neighborhood. In you could set down at a dusty field, pinned to a map by one thin name, shake hands, refuel, trade weather, share a meal, and lift off again. You could step into local time and step out of it, carrying the courtesy forward to the next place. The circle was not just the shape of the route, it was the shape of the idea. The idea mattered because the hour was tense. Nationalism was sharpening its elbows. Propaganda discovered the camera's love of uniforms. In such a mood, a woman in a leather jacket and a practical smile became a counter-argument in motion. Her flight would not assert dominance, it would assert competence. It would bypass podiums and perform the fact that a globe is navigable, that cooperation, landing rights, fuel agreements, weather briefings, quietly undergirds even the most dramatic feats. The world flight, in that sense, was a map of dependence, and dependence, framed correctly, is not weakness, but recognition. We require one another to do almost anything worth doing. Consider the stages of such a trip in 1937, when radar was newborn rumor and radio a capricious companion. Each leg was a negotiation with geography and bureaucracy. Permissions had to be secured from governments at different latitudes of mood. Fuel had to be positioned in places where barrels arrived as events, not deliveries. Maintenance had to be performed by hands, sometimes meeting the aircraft for the first time. The pilot became a diplomat with an altimeter, the navigator a cartographer who also knew the delicate politics of asking for help. Lists abounded: spare parts, tools, medicine, charts. Fail to remember a gasket, and the next takeoff could be a sermon on regret. Succeed in one more long overwater leg, and the world itself seemed to tilt a fraction of a degree closer together. There is a certain gentleness to the language of globalization in hindsight, as if it were a breeze that simply rose and enveloped us. But in those days, it was sweat and specifics, and the airplane was both the point and the punctuation. Newspapers would print a line showing yesterday's leg. This field to that island, this port city to that inland runway. The line looked simple. It was not. Beneath it lay the infrastructure of cooperation. Meteorologists trading reports, harbor masters relaying swells, colonial administrators approving landings, villagers rolling drums of fuel across coral. International was not an adjective. It was a work order. That is the perspective from which Earhart's last flight becomes more than a personal tragedy. It sits at an inflection point. In a few years, the skies would be full of aircraft serving another logic entirely. Transport planes shouldering troops and cargo, bombers rewriting the edges of cities, fighters arguing in contrails that coiled like strange punctuation marks across the stratosphere. The dreamy maps of airlines would become military logistics. Island names once circled for their rest houses, and radio towers would become code words whispered before dawn. The Pacific's distances did not increase or decrease. Their meaning changed. Her vanished plane becomes, in that broader frame, a quiet memorial to a civilian impulse, curiosity in the service of connection, just as the world was bracing to let other impulses lead. And yet the disappearance refuses to rest in the singular. It keeps sending ripples forward. It continues to ask questions that modern tools try to answer and that modern imagination refuses to leave alone. One version of the story says the most ordinary thing happened in the most indifferent place. A forced descent into ocean, a quick unthreading of machine from sky, a silence that water knows how to maintain. Another version says land was reached, but not salvation, that an uninhabited atoll gave temporary ground and cruel company. Heat, thirst, the indifferent patience of the sea, while rescue searched a little left of true. Other theories multiply the further we drift from the hour itself. Misidentification, capture, secret missions imagined in the creases where documentation thins. Mysteries breed hypotheses the way coral breeds islands. Textured, plausible from a distance, less certain up close. What persists is the search. And the search itself is a time machine of methods. In the first days, ships and planes fanned out, masters of their art, but limited by the tools of their time. Radio direction finding that could lose its way. Charts that could be precise and wrong at once. Eyeballs scanning an ocean more intent on its own weather than on revealing a clue. Later decades added sonar that could comb the seafloor with sound. Cameras dropped into water thick as history. Expeditions that married forensic patience to maritime stubbornness. In our own time, algorithms whisper suggestions over satellite images. Volunteers trace grids on screens, clicking through blue upon blue for geometric ghosts. A world that once relied on a few trained eyes now offers many untrained but willing ones. And sometimes that is how a pattern emerges. Not from expertise alone, but from the multiplication of attention. If you pull back still further, there is a philosophical utility to the not knowing. An unresolved story engages the part of the mind that prefers hypotheses to endings. It allows each generation to project its own technologies and anxieties onto the same blank. In the 1960s, the Cold War produced espionage narratives. In the 1990s, forensic anthropology carried new confidence to old bones and artifacts. Now, machine learning and remote sensing promise to turn the ocean's opacity into a solvable texture. We keep offering the mystery new instruments, like musicians trying different keys on a melody they can hum, but not finish. That persistence is human. So is the parallel urge to put the matter to bed, to draw a circle around an answer, and let the dead rest and the living move on. But the mystery does more than tantalize. It holds a mirror to our changing relationship with risk and proof. In the 1930s, a radio log could be the last trace of a life. No black boxes, no satellite pings, no transponders painting bright identifications on a controller's screen. Today, a private plane's path is courted by invisible hands, GPS constellations, ADS-B broadcasts, layers of redundancy. When a modern disappearance does occur, the world reacts with shock, multiplied by the presumption that such things no longer happen. Earhart's vanishing reminds us that certainty is a recent luxury and a conditional one. The planet is mapped, but not entirely. Technology is vigilant, but not omniscient. The ocean accepts our instruments and gives back what it chooses. The personal and the global intersect again here. The world flight symbolized globalization because it required and displayed a choreography of cooperation. Its loss symbolizes something too, the friction in the gears of connection. Networks fail, frequencies drift, bearings mislead, intentions collide with circumstance. The lesson is not paralysis, but humility. When we say the world is small, We mean that travel compresses experience, but the world is also large in the ways that matter to survival. Weather large enough to insist, distances large enough to punish small errors, bureaucracies large enough to slow a hand. Earhart's ambition honored the smallness. Her absence reminds us of the largeness, and yet, honor the ambition we must. The world flight, had it finished as planned, would have joined a catalog of firsts that readers honor and then shelve. Its incompletion keeps it near, keeps it asking, what were the tolerances of the era, of radios, of bearings, of fuel calculations done under human fatigue? What were the tolerances of institutions, of Coast Guard stations tasked with listening, of colonial governments with their priorities, of manufacturers building machines for conditions they only partly understood? Each question spools outward to a present that still negotiates these margins. In medicine and climate science and the brittle networks of commerce, how much redundancy do we invest in? What cultures of error checking do we insist on? What training? What humility? What ritual of review? The island theories, the ocean theories, the theories that involve other human hands, they are all attempts to anchor grief. An artifact found on a lonely shore tugs the thread of our attention. A sonar return, mysterious as a dream, gathers articles around it like barnacles. A photograph, ambiguous and old, invites interpretation until it turns elastic, saying whatever the viewer need it to say. We are narrative creatures. We prefer the suggestive to the mute, a puzzle with workable pieces to a blank that refuses even to be tragic, choosing instead to be vast. The Pacific, with its internal weather and moving floor, prefers vast. It is possible that the truest thing we will ever know is that a line of flight curved toward silence and entered it. Even so, silence has tones. One of them is respect for the work done before the last moment, for the professionalism of a crew that did not confuse daring with sloppiness, for the network of searchers who answered with their own craft. Another tone is invitation, to keep learning, to build systems that make repeats less likely, to remember that connection is not only an idea, but an investment in equipment and training and shared standards. A third tone is gentleness. We can speak of the unresolved without making a spectacle of it. We can honor an emblem without flattening the person beneath it. What endures most clearly is the contrail of influence. The movement for women's equal participation in technical fields did not begin with a single name, and it did not end with one. But Amelia Earhart occupies a bright, durable point along that arc. After her, it became slightly easier for a woman to be interviewed as an expert on aviation, rather than as an exception to it. It became slightly harder to argue, with a straight face, that women lacked the temperament for precise, high-stakes work. This slightly matters. Cultural change often arrives in millimeters. Multiply those by years, and by the number of people introduced to a wider sense of possibility, and you can measure a shift. Meanwhile, the sky she helped normalize became the default corridor of the modern world. The global we speak so casually, global trade, global news, global culture, rides on fleets of aircraft whose pilots speak the same technical language in Doha and in Denver, who trust weather models that blend data from satellites and buoys and planes themselves, who land at airports designed to the same standards of lighting and signage and emergency procedure. That confidence, that commonality, has a lineage. It owes itself to engineers and regulators, yes, to the quiet disciplines of everyday safety. But it also owes itself to the early flyers who taught the public that the sky can be domesticated without being disrespected. That distance can be dealt with in days rather than months. That a globe can be crossed by a route rather than only by resolve. And so Earhart's story, seen from the balcony of historical perspective, is two stories braided. One is the tale of a person and a machine, of preparation and chance, of a flight that did not conclude in the way we would have all preferred. The other is the tale of a world learning that its parts are connected, sometimes tenderly and sometimes perilously, and that those connections demand maintenance as surely as an engine does. Her world flight announcement was a promise written in the grammar of routes. Its disappearance is a marginal note that reads, "Do not romanticize the line. Attend to the whole page." If you stand at a modern airport and watch the evening departures, lights blinking, engines rolling heavy and sure, you are witnessing the fulfilled portion of her idea. People step onto aluminum and trust that they will be delivered, and they are. The choreography of safety is so complete that many travelers never think to admire it. And that, too, is a victory for the vision she served. A world where flight is not astonishing but available, where courage is still required in the design and the maintenance, but not demanded from the passenger reading a novel at seat 17A. Somewhere in that ordinariness, the extraordinary continues. A long ago pilot aimed at the edge of the known, and now the known has shifted. As for the mystery, let it remain what it is, a quiet room in the Museum of the Century. Scholars will enter with measuring tapes and hypotheses. Divers will arrive with new lights. Enthusiasts will lean over the velvet rope and whisper what they think they see in the shadows. The room will accept all of this and keep its temperature steady. What matters is what we carry back out. A renewed respect for precision. A sense that symbols are utilities if we treat them as such. A memory that the ocean's blue is both invitation and threshold. We need not plunder the room for more drama than it contains. It has enough. A person who believed in lines connecting places. An aircraft built to draw such lines. A morning that began in hope. A noon that demanded skill. And an afternoon that somewhere slipped into quiet. The rest is a work of generations, of engineers, regulators, teachers, mentors, and yes, storytellers, keeping the sky honest. In that spirit, the historical perspective offers its final piece. The world on the brink of war was not only a rehearsal for violence, it was also a proving ground for cooperation. The technologies of connection, radio, aviation, navigation, would be drafted into conflict and then returned, wiser, to civilian life. The symbol of a global flight belonged to that gentler part of the arc, the part that says, let us meet, learn, trade, visit, help. Earhart's disappearance does not cancel that symbol. Paradoxically, it strengthens it because it asks us to earn it. Safety is not sentiment. It is structure. Connection is not romance. It is discipline. And the sky is not a stage set for human meaning. It is a medium requiring respect. So we hold both truths at once. The world shrank. The world remains large. A woman flew into history's bloodstream. Her last coordinates dissolved. The map of routes grew denser. One thin line faded. Between those facts, the present finds its balance and its task. To keep building the systems that turn daring into routine, and to remember, when routine seduces us into carelessness, that the ocean is patient and the altimeter lyric but unforgiving. From that balance comes a soft, durable wisdom, fit for evening, that honors the person and the era at once. We go farther when we go together, and we go safely when we go humbly. Dawn comes thin and colorless overlay, a pale wash that turns the runway into a ribbon of damp light. The Lockheed Electra waits with that coiled stillness airplanes have before first motion. Skin taut over ribs, engines quiet as held breath. The map for this leg is simple in the way that difficult things often look simple. Lay to Howland, a speck of coral in the world's largest blue. 2 points, a straight idea. Between them, 2,500 miles of ocean, scattered cloud, winds that are polite on paper and personal in the air. They lift off with the steadiness of people who have rehearsed calm. The city falls away into thumbnail houses, rectangles of tin and wood. The coast unwinds, green to surf white, then to that vast enamel blue. Amelia adjusts her headset. Fred Noonan leans over charts that he could draw from memory, but trusts more when they are under his fingers. Sun angle, drift, airspeed, fuel. The cockpit becomes arithmetic and listening. The hum of the right engine, the slightly different hum of the left, the soft rattle of a loose pencil near a map's edge. The radio is a companion with moods. Morning climbs. The air looks clear enough to be trustworthy, but the sky is a host who prefers hints to promises. Clouds begin to grow, like careful handwriting near the horizon, cumulus in small paragraphs. The Electra threads them, skirting towers, gliding through white rooms where instruments blink in a private universe of gray. When they break out, the ocean looks briefly nearer, the way a floor does when you come down a step in the dark. Wind nudges from the east more than forecast. A note is made. A correction, too. Noonan's pencil ticks a mark. The course is bent by a degree that seems trivial now and will shadow the day. Hours are measured in the kind of talk that keeps focus clean. Speed checks, drift estimates, a little fuel math spoken evenly. In the cabin aft, extra tanks hold their quiet. Amber weight, miles waiting to be burned. Somewhere far ahead, a Coast Guard cutter named Itasca paces the appointed waters near an island so narrow that it can hide behind a wave. Its radio watch is steady. Operators brew coffee, the tastes of tin and sleeplessness. Antennas lift like hands waiting to catch a voice. The first calls are confident, practical. Position reports sent like postcards. We were here, now here. Then the air thickens with distance. The mid-ocean hours have a dangerous serenity. Sky, sea, a small boat of aluminum between them. Clouds arrive in more decisive neighborhoods now, smudging the sun. Noonan's sextant comes out. The cockpit learns a ritual of angles and light. The sun gives up its number, but grudgingly through haze. Another correction, another note. The radio crackles with faint replies that seem to lean in, then retreat. Frequencies are tuned, knobs adjusted with the small, precise movements of hands that know they must not express what the heart is tempted to. By late morning, the Itasca's crew hears her more clearly. A voice, unmistakably hers, cool, clipped, businesslike, reports that fuel is good, that they are on schedule. Then later, cloud banks, difficulties with bearings. We are about 200 miles out. Something like that, carried in bursts between carpets of static. The cutter transmits homing signals. The sky, indifferent, edits the air between them. One operator bites his lip. Another makes a neat note of the time. Neat notes soothe. The world narrows. The ocean, which had been a field, becomes a texture of long swells, ranks of water marching on business of their own. In the cockpit, The instruments are steady but small. The horizon is too uniform to offer favors. Howland's profile is an idea. You do not find such a place by seeing it. You find it by arriving in the only corridor where seeing is possible. The room of the sky feels larger and more empty in the same second. Amelia's voice returns. We must be on you, but cannot see you. The sentence is brisk, without panic. The kind of sentence a pilot speaks to keep the possible from shrinking. Itasca answers, sending code and voice, flame and smoke. Black plumes from the stack as if to write a line on the air. A searchlight sweeps. Signal lamps blink. On deck, binoculars lift and lower. One man scans until his eyes ache at the seam where sky stitches to sea. On the radio log, ink steadies what breath cannot. Times, frequencies, signal strength. If attention could be shaped into a lighthouse, the cutter would be blazing. But attention has its limits, and the morning's weather is in the habit of folding signals into itself and setting them down elsewhere. Fuel math now speaks more candidly. Noonan folds a chart with an economy that suggests rehearsal and hope in one motion. Earhart's voice, thinner, more deliberate. We are on the line, 157-337. A line, not a point, a last geometry. If Howland is not seen, they will ride that line northeast and southwest, searching where math says the island ought to be, where a run of luck and a clearing of cloud might lift coral into sight. The phrase hangs in the radio room like a compass rose pinned to the wall. Men murmur its numbers as if they might conjure a glint of wing from emptiness. Somewhere along that invisible ruler, the day tilts. Sun climbs to a position that makes sight both easier and crueler. Reflection off water becomes a second sky, a bright deceit. The Itasca hears another fragment, unreadable, then gone. The operator leans closer to the speaker, as if proximity could change physics. A chief quietly orders more black smoke. Mariners tell stories of lining up on beacons and missing them by less than a mile forever. The ocean is not malicious. It is merely vast and busy with its own light. There is no one instant when drama flares into catastrophe. There is instead a lengthening of intervals, a softening of signals, and the intimate knowledge in practiced minds that the numbers have run their patient course. Fuel, like time, is not a negotiator. If you could freeze the air above those swells, you might see the Electra glide like a thought too fine to catch, then commit to the surface with whatever kindness the sea will allow. You might see aluminum flash in a last bright signature before the water folds its blue over mirrors and whispers. Or you might see, in another telling, an atoll arrive in a pale circle, a rough landing on coral, a pause made of heat and wind, and a radio that keeps pleading into emptiness. Both scenes are ordinary in the way endings often are. No music, just the small noises of things completing the work they were built to do. On the cutter, the log keeps filling. No further contact. Word travels the way it did then, by cable, by teletype, by headlines that learn to be careful, even when urgency tempts them not to be. Search planes lift, sweep methodically, return with eyes stung and fuel low. Ships plot grids and obey them. The Pacific is too large to be bullied into confession. The first day becomes the second, then the third, each one a gradual unthreading of hope's tight weave. Radios listen until the act of listening feels like prayer. And then the long work of aftermath begins, the calmer brutality of paperwork and plans. Routes are retraced on tables. Theories stand in line for inspection. Some are modest, a navigational error magnified by a headwind, a frequency mismatch that turned homing signals to ghosts. Some are wishful, a landing on a nearby reef, a survival measured in days. Others are opportunistic, stitched from the era's darker cloth. Capture, secrets, rescue hidden by bureaucracy. Each hypothesis has its own gravity. Some collapse under their own weight. Some drift for decades, gathering respectful attention and careful counterargument. The ocean, however, keeps its manner. The search expands and contracts across years. In one decade, sonar trawls the bottom, painting the seafloor in shades of uncertainty. In another, a bone or a scrap of metal found on a lonely shore throws up a question that takes months to frame and years to shelve. Volunteers study grainy photographs, draw lines, circle shapes that might be wreckage or might be the ocean playing with light. Expeditions assemble with checklists that look like liturgies. Batteries charged, lines coiled, permissions granted, weather windows found. They go. They return. They go again. Each attempt is an act of respect, not only for a legend, but for the plain dignity of a clear answer. Meanwhile, the story loosens from the particulars and takes its place among the symbolic furniture of the century. Children hear it in classrooms and learn two lessons at once: that daring is beautiful, and that the world is not obligated to tidy endings. Pilots repeat the radio calls in training, not as incantations, but as reminders of how precision and luck interlace. Historians argue kindly over details that matter, because details are how we keep faith with the past. The public, which begins with appetite for drama, matures toward a quieter admiration, the kind that respects both skill and uncertainty. What remains on land is a life enlarged by myth and made smaller by loss. In museum cases, a leather jacket holds its shape as if someone has just stepped out of it to check the weather. A logbook lies open to a neat script, lines of ink that still look fresh. Photographs refuse to yellow as fast as they should, holding a grin at a tilt that has become shorthand for a quality we want in ourselves. Resolute, decent, keen. The human being behind those objects is not lost. Friends remember a voice that could cut through a room without raising itself, a laugh that arrived quickly and left space for others to add theirs, a habit of writing notes with an economy that never looked stingy. And offshore, where swells keep their long appointments, the specific remains unresolved. This is not a failure. Some stories ask to be tended rather than solved. In tending them, we learn to be particular about what we know and modest about what we guess. We invest in better beacons, tighter procedures, radios that agree with the people who need them. We standardize, we teach, we run drills until the extraordinary becomes wonderfully boring. These are the durable memorials, safer routes, clearer protocols, a culture that treats risk as a teacher rather than a dare. As for the legends that bloom at the edges, spy missions, disguises, lives lived out in secret, they are wishes in costume, attempts to exchange the honesty of uncertainty for the comfort of narrative. They persist because uncertainty is an acquired taste. We can smile at them and return to the chart table. The truest romance here is not conspiracy, but craft. A pilot and a navigator doing exacting work in a world that offered fewer instruments and more sky. In the quiet that follows the last confirmed call, you can hear the century turning. The interwar dream of connecting the globe by lines of goodwill is about to be interrupted by lines of supply and sortie. The island names on their maps will become coordinates in other stories, and yet this flight, unfinished as it is, refuses to sour. It reminds us that there is courage in attempting the necessary before the comfortable, that ambition can be disciplined, that symbolism is most useful when it is earned by labor. So the narrative, which tightened into worry, loosens into something softer. The ocean returns to being ocean. The cutter's smoke thins and blows away. The logbook closes. On shore, a desk lamp is clicked off. A letter is folded. A door is locked with one last gentle check. The legend does not end. It repositions itself, not at the center of calamity, but in the long aisle where inspiration lives. She becomes less a riddle to solve and more a constant to carry, a person who aimed at the edge of the known and persuaded the known to move. In that sense, the disappearance is not a void, but a margin. Margins are where we write notes to our future selves. We have written, since 1937, many such notes. Build better radios. Teach navigation with redundancy. Share weather without pride. Remember that fatigue is an enemy. Know that small islands do not forgive large assumptions. We have also written the opposite kind of note, the one you leave on a refrigerator for someone you love. Back soon. It is an optimism that speaks in present tense even when the clock argues. Perhaps that is the tone in which her story ought to rest, not in sorrow's heavy key, but in a quiet, durable resolve. Long after the search grids faded from sea charts, long after newspapers folded into archives and radios went silent, the evening sky continued to fill with the predictable glow of routes she helped make ordinary. Passengers lift their shades to see a line of dawn, and somewhere below, an island small as a thumbnail slides by unnoticed, exactly as planned. In that ordinariness lies the true culmination. The world did not turn away from the sky because it once withheld an answer. It kept asking, learned to ask more carefully, and made of flight a daily kindness. And so the resolution is not a single sentence, but a change of rhythm. The rush of the last calls dissolves into a slower, contemplative time. Names soften into places, places into weather, weather into a hush generous enough to hold what we know and what we do not. The ocean keeps its counsel. The story keeps its work. And somewhere, in the forgiving pace of evening, a pair of propellers turn once more in imagination, steady and sure, carrying forward not a certainty, but a promise that the line between us, however faint, however long, can be drawn with care. There's a question that visits at the end of long stories, the way dusk visits the edge of a field. Was this courage, or was it desperation? With Amelia, the answer refuses to stand on a single word. Courage and desperation are cousins who borrow each other's coats. From a distance, they look similar. Up close, they part. Desperation rushes because it fears the clock. Courage moves steadily because it respects the clock. Desperation is loud with its own need. Courage is quiet with its own duty. What she did, what she prepared for, learned for, bent her days toward, was not a gamble flung in defiance of sense. It was a disciplined assent to risk, made in service of a belief that the sky could be democratized, that a map could be drawn large enough for many and precise enough to be trusted. If there was any desperation in her, it belonged to a different register. The impatience to live up to one's own measure, the unwillingness to let possibility drift while someone else defined the limits. That kind of restlessness does not burn the checklists. It writes them. It does not disdain caution. It appoints caution as a companion. And yet, every real attempt carries a spark of audacity. The irreducible remainder after planning has done its best. At the outer edges of preparation, A human being must step into the unguaranteed. If we demand that all heroism be riskless, we will have none. If we demand that all risk be heroic, we will lose the thread of reason. Amelia's journey finds the middle line: respect for danger without worship of it, a willingness to stake reputation on the claim that competence, careful, repeatable, teachable, can ferry us across distances that used to be called impossible. What then does it mean to leave a mystery behind? To leave one is not to fail a story. Sometimes it is to feed it. Mystery is not simply absence. It is a space held open, a pause with intention. Historians prefer evidence that completes the circle. Engineers prefer answers that permit redesign. Both desires are noble, but there is also value in the unanswered, because it trains a civic muscle that modernity forgets to exercise: humility. In the absence of final proof, we practice restraint. We label conjecture. We tidy the boundary between what we can show and what we only suspect. A culture that keeps such boundaries clean is one that can argue without becoming cruel, can debate without becoming lost, can listen without feeling diminished. The sea kept a fact from us. In return, it offered a lesson in how to be exact without pretending to be omniscient. The deeper tie, of course, is older than radios or rivets. Humans have always leaned toward the horizon. The first sailors argued with wind and guessed at stars. The first walkers chose the ridge over the valley just to see what the world looked like from there. Flight felt inevitable long before it was possible. Children lie on their backs and follow birds with their eyes. Even the word beyond has a small draft of air in it. This urge to go a little farther, a little higher, to make a path and then make it a road, belongs to our species as surely as storytelling does. We push outward not only to bring new things home, but to enlarge the home itself. Each route established, each procedure refined, each peril understood and made manageable becomes part of the quiet infrastructure of ordinary days. What begins as audacity matures into everyday kindness. A grandmother crossing the country in an afternoon, a shipment of medicine beating a storm, a reunion made simple by a ticket and a gate number. When we borrow the sky, we borrow it from the ocean as well. The two are partners in a long conversation. The ocean is not only distance, it is also memory. It does not archive as librarians do, with boxes and tags, but it archives nevertheless, folding wreckage and weather and rumor into currents that take years to confess. To call it a keeper of secrets is to give it our vocabulary for its own work. It keeps nothing on purpose. It keeps because keeping is what water does when it is deep and wide and busy with moon and wind. Still, the image comforts. A vast blue library, shelves made of thermoclines and ancient salt, storing what it must until some configuration of light and luck retrieves a page. And if the page never returns, then what we have is the margin, and margins are places of grace. We write our questions there. We leave our offerings there, sonar traces, careful papers, respectful theories. We visit, circle, withdraw, and in the long interval, we become slightly better at the disciplines that guard life. Communication that fails less often, navigation that cross-checks itself, training that rehearses error until error becomes unlikely. The ocean's refusal becomes a teacher's refusal. Not now, not like this. Try again with cleaner work. Think of the sky at dawn, the hour she loved, a pale seam opening over water, instrument steady, the engine's song low and even. That is the sound of a promise kept daily by people whose names rarely make it into history. Controllers with kind voices, mechanics whose fingertips catch a misaligned bolt, dispatchers who see thunderstorms as if they were paragraphs in a memo to be routed around. The spirit we attach to Amelia, the insistence that nerve must be married to method, survives in them. It survives every time a crew declines a takeoff because the weight and balance sheet looks wrong by a hair. It survives every time a pilot says unable to a request that nibbles at safety. Courage, in mature form, often sounds like no. Yet the romance remains, not as glitter, but as glow. A small aircraft lifts from a grass strip at evening, wingtip flashing. A long-haul jet curves along a track that satellites watch with quiet guardianship. Somewhere in the desert, a test pilot pushes a prototype into the unknown and delivers to tomorrow a better-handled slice of air. The desire to fly farther than we can is not a sickness of overreach. It is a negotiation of limits done in good faith. Limits move when we treat them with respect. They harden when we taunt them. Earhart's example argues for the first. Interrogate the boundary. Don't insult it. Prepare, then proceed. Accept that sometimes the boundary answers by stepping back, and sometimes by standing still with a silence you must honor. There is, too, the matter of legacy shaped like a lantern. Not everyone will fly. But everyone moves through private weather, navigates long stretches where bearings are uncertain, and fuel, the emotional kind, must be husbanded. We read her story and learn small, transferable arts. How to keep lists that are kind to the future self. How to speak simply about complicated tasks. How to ask for help without surrendering competence. How to wear attention without letting it alter the work. Her calm in transmissions is a style the rest of us can borrow. State what is known. State what is needed. Keep fear on a short leash. Keep arrogance on a shorter one. And what of the mystery's moral weight? Does it imprison or expand? Done badly, it can become a carnival, a marketplace of outlandish vendors. Done well, it becomes a chapel. Quiet, proportioned, open to contemplation. To leave a room in history unlit is not to invite ghosts. It is to invite patience. Visitors step softly. Read the plaques of what is known. Resist the urge to scribble their certainties on the wall. When evidence arrives, we move the rope line a few inches. That is the work of grown cultures. To change the exhibit without needing to change the tone. The night grows friendlier as we follow these thoughts. The Pacific, in imagination, lies smoothed by starlight. The anxiety of search grids has given way to the geometry of constellations, ancient coordinates that cared for sailors long before frequencies were assigned and towers blinked. Polaris holds its appointment. Orion leans. The Southern Cross balances like a careful promise. Stars ask nothing from us but attention and give, in exchange, a sense of proportion and a kind of permission. Proceed gently. We have been watching travelers longer than there have been names for you. So, a soft ending. Picture the Lockheed as the mind loves to, not in trouble, not in the strict court of analysis, but as an outline crossing a tender sky. The fuselage is pewter in early light. The propellers draw their neat, invisible circles. The cockpit glows with the small lamps of focus. Far below, the ocean's surface looks ironed, then wrinkled, then vast, then intimate the way a breath against a window is intimate. In a moment, the plane becomes indistinct, not gone, just part of the light's grammar. That is how evening concludes its best stories, by returning everything to its proper scale. On shore, the day slackens. A lamp is turned low. A book is closed without triumph. A page is marked with something simple, a receipt, a leaf. The mind lingers on a few images it chooses to keep. A scarf bright as resolve, a hand on a checklist, lines neat enough to steady the pulse, a smile that is not performative, but present. Resolve, steadiness, presence. These are the true souvenirs. They weigh little and improve with use. If you step outside before bed, the air may carry a trace of fuel from a distant departure, or the faintest thrum of a turbofan far above weather. You may not see the aircraft. You will see its line, a slow, moving star. Somewhere aboard, a stranger takes a sip of water and checks a map on a rectangle of light. A pilot marks a waypoint. A cabin attendant tucks a blanket around a sleeping shoulder. Ordinary kindness at altitude. That is the quiet empire Amelia helped to found. No banners, only procedures and patience, held together by the unshowy promise that people will arrive. The ocean receives the sky's reflection and keeps it. The sky receives our intentions and tests them. Between those two immensities, a single life extended itself toward a useful idea and then vanished in a way that refuses melodrama. The story we tell in response should match that dignity. We do not need thunder in the last paragraphs. We need accuracy, gratitude, and a tempered wonder. So let the final images be small and clear. A plane dissolving into a sunrise that does not hurry. Water smoothing after a ship has passed, the wake braiding itself back into calm. A row of runway lights answering the first stars, Earth's patient constellations replying to heavens. And above them all, the old navigation of light, pinpricks that once taught us where we were, and still can, if we look long enough. In that light, the question of courage resolves. It is not the absence of fear, or the itch to be immortal. It is the decision to meet a horizon with skill and a good heart, and then to accept whatever the world answers. Applause, silence, or something between. The ocean keeps its counsel. The sky keeps its distances. We keep the lesson. Proceed with care. Share what you learn. Leave the place more navigable than you found it. And when a mystery remains, let it remain with grace. The stars, those old mentors, continue their work, stitching night to night. The ocean breathes, vast and even. Somewhere, an airplane lifts, small against all that, and becomes a simple line moving from one kind of darkness toward another kind of light. The night has settled into its gentle order. Sky above, ocean below, a narrow hush between. We return to the simplest images because they were always enough. First, the sky, wide as a promise you can't finish in one breath. It holds the faint lines of roots and the brighter lines of stars. It forgives our crossings and tests our preparations. In its dark, we learned patience. In its dawn, we learned proportion. Up there, aluminum becomes intention, and intention becomes a line that moves. Then freedom, not the noisy kind that demands witness, but the practiced kind, the freedom of method. Checklists that quiet the pulse. A headset settled softly. Hands that know where each control lives without searching. Freedom is not a leap, but a discipline that lets a leap endure. Earhart understood that. She wore it plainly, the way a pilot wears a jacket, for function first, and then for whatever grace follows, and silence. The particular silence of altitude, the engine's steady hum wrapping a core of calm, the radio between calls, the long stretch where the ocean says nothing and means no harm by it. Silence as interval, not emptiness. It is the measure between one piece of certainty and the next. It is the place where courage gets to breathe. We stand now at the soft edge of an era, and we let it go with care. The 1930s recede, neon in rain, newspapers warm from the press, hangar doors rolling back like theater curtains. The future stepped in. Procedures multiplied. Beacons learned to speak more clearly. What was daring became service. What was spectacle became schedule. That is a good ending for an age, to see its wildness tamed into safety without losing its wonder. Picture her once more. Not the headline, not the theory. Just a figure at the threshold of flight. A scarf knotted against a practical breeze. A smile with work behind it. The small bow of the head when the checklist is complete. Propellers turning their clean circles. A runway narrowing into permission. Pause there. The ocean's surface is smooth as thought. It keeps the last of the light like a secret it intends to share someday in its own way. Far above, the old navigation holds. Polaris steady, the Southern Cross exact. Orion with his familiar angles. Constellations that taught centuries to travel and still ask only that we look up and learn. Another pause. A modern jet lifts from a distant airport. Someone in seat 17A tilts the shade, sees a horizon drawn in silver. No trumpet announces the miracle. It is offered quietly, as most good things are now, with redundancy, with training, with a culture that learned from those who went first. This, too, is her afterlife, ordinary kindness at altitude. So we keep the images we need. Sky, freedom, silence. We let them arrange the room of our thoughts for the night. If you listen, you might hear the soft grammar of engines, somewhere far off. Not loud, not urgent. Just a reminder that the world still moves toward itself, that distances are smaller when tended, that maps accept new lines. And if you look up, the stars answer with their patient brightness. They have seen beginnings that looked like endings, and endings that brought new kinds of beginning. They have watched 100 myths come home wiser. They have time for us. They invite us to match their calm. This is where we leave her, in motion, not in dispute, not trapped in a question mark, but arrowed toward the idea she served, that we can cross and learn and return with better ways for others to follow. The leather cools on a chair back. A logbook closes. A lamp dims. The runway lights keep their quiet vigil, bead by measured bead into the darkness. Amelia's voice may be lost to the winds, but her story still glides through the skies of history.